Lecture 10, Jazz It Up. This is a second take. The first time I recorded it and put it on YouTube, it had copy strikes, 3 of them. So we'll do it without the recordings. All the links to the recordings I mentioned will be in the description. Dr. Billy Taylor once called jazz America's classical music, which seems apropos seeing jazz's influence. It's fundamental in the development of pop, rock, and hip-hop musics. Its emphasis on improvisation, spontaneity, freedom, the individual and communal, adaptability, change, the importance of rules and potential for disruption, as well as jazz's place within the U.S. national identity, its artistic worth, its lasting legacy. In this lecture, we dive into the history of jazz. Every history told is also a story. And the story of jazz's founding is ambiguous and difficult to describe with perfect authority. What seems certain is jazz developed in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Unlike most states during the era of African American enslavement, 1619 to 1865, Louisiana law tolerated African traditional musics. On Sundays, enslaved people gathered to sing, play drums, banjos, and other instruments, and dance in Congo Square in New Orleans, beginning with French and Spanish colonial rule. African traditions were maintained and developed into what eventually would become jazz music, spirituals, ragtime, and the blues. The musics preserved and shared in places like Congo Square became forms of communication used in the Underground Railroad, carrying coded messages, and were part of rebellions such as the 1739 Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. New Orleans jazz clarinetist and saxophonist Sidney Bechet, 1897 to 1959, who first gained renown in 1914 playing with bands led by Freddie Keppard and King Oliver, and then in Chicago, New York, and Paris through the 1920s and 30s, where he had a successful career as a soloist, began his autobiography near the end of his life. He published Treated Gentle in 1960 and recalled his family connection to jazz's origin. And I think it's interesting, so I'm keeping a big long quote here from the book. My grandfather was a slave, but he was a man that could do anything. He could sing, he danced, he was a leader. It was natural to him, and everyone followed him. His name was Omar. He was a musician. No one had to explain notes or rhythm or feeling to him. It was all there inside him, something he was always sure of. He made his own drums out of skins of a pig or horsehide. Back in those days, Sundays were free for slaves. He'd wake up and start to be a slave, and then maybe someone would tell him, "Today's Sunday, man. Today's free day." And then he'd hear drums from the square. First one drum, then another one answering it, then a lot of drums, then a voice, one voice, then a refrain, a lot of voices joining and coming into each other. The music being bored right inside itself, not knowing how it was getting to be music, one thing being responsible for another. Improvisation. That's what it was. It was primitive and it was crude, but down at the bottom of it, inside it, where it starts to get into itself, down there it had the same thing there was at the bottom of ragtime. Omar never had to hear it from a distance, because he was always ahead of the music there. It was his drum, his voice, his dancing. That's the end of the quote. It's brilliant how he connects his family to his early life and memories and the stories told in his family to jazz. Bechet, an African-American French Creole, described jazz as a meeting of Africa and Paris, and ended his career in France, not the U.S., so that he could gain personal and artistic liberty during the repressive Jim Crow 1950s. He described learning jazz via the second lines. During parades, a second line would form after the parade where people would sing and play instruments, improvising behind the hired bands. The tradition continues to this day in New Orleans in the form of the jazz funeral, which involves a procession from the church to the cemetery with mournful religious songs and dirges such as Just a Closer Walk with Thee, played by wind and instruments and drums, and later upbeat ragtime and jazz tunes such as When the Saints Go Marching In were played to rejoice the deceased new life in heaven. Established musicians played in the primary group, near family members, but in second lines formed as everybody in the community celebrated, and amateur musicians would then develop their musical skills in a spontaneous improvisational setting. Rather than taking more than a handful of lessons, then, musicians like Bechet developed their own techniques and riffs during these second lines. This freestyle, individual learning approach is likely a key reason jazz musicians develop different timbres, sound colors, than classically trained musicians. So, in class, we'll listen to polyphony, many improvised melodies playing at once, and Sidney Bechet's clarinet playing in the 1923 Clarence Williams Blue 5 recording, Wildcat Blues. And you can either follow the link or you can just search it out. That recording is on YouTube a few different places. The 1920s became known as the Jazz Age, since jazz music and dance became the most popular music during the 1920s in the U.S. and other Western nations. This era saw people celebrating post-World War I economic prosperity, the Harlem Renaissance, and increased legal rights for women, with the right to vote coming in 1920. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, curtailed disposable income and led to a decline in the high-priced social gatherings that fueled the Jazz Age. With the shift of the Western world's care from entertainment to subsistence, jazz changed from complex, polyphonic improvisations of New Orleans jazz to the more reserved, polished, and less improvisatory big band era. Big bands are large jazz orchestras with 12 to 25 musicians that led popular music charts in the 1930s and 40s, also called the swing era. Big band music can be heard in films, radio shows, dance halls, and clubs. Big bands featured saxophones, trumpets, trombones, and a rhythm section, piano, bass, drums, and guitar, and often featured vocalists. By the late 1940s, big band music declined in popularity, with the emergence of rock and roll, and among jazz aficionados, bebop. Today, big band music is often featured in World War II films, with Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie being the most popular acts. During its heyday, swing dance halls were all over the U.S., and I even have an album of the Duke Ellington Big Band playing at the Sunset Ballroom just outside Patton, PA in Cambria County, where I grew up. By the time I was young, all that was left of the Sunset Ballroom was its grown-over foundation in the woods off 219, connecting Patton with Carrolltown. Other musicians to perform at the Sunset were Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, and Glenn Miller. We're going to listen to the Duke Ellington and his famous orchestra's 1941 recording of Take the A-Train, written by Pittsburgh jazz composer Billy Strayhorn. So another connection to Pennsylvania. It's very important. So we're here in 1941, right in the middle of World War II. The 1941 song, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, is a classic World War II swing-era song. It tells the story of a Chicago jazz trumpeter who is drafted into the Army. Disappointed he cannot continue to pursue his professional music career, His sergeant lets him jazz up his bugle calls for the company. The song becomes a signature song for the Andrews Sisters and helped boost morale during the war. Listen to the Andrews Sisters' performance of Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy. Just as after World War I, military musicians introduced marching bands to the public schools, which still endure today, after World War II, returning servicemen found employment in high schools and introduced big bands. High schools and universities in the U.S. continue to have big bands, though much of the repertoire includes songs from the 1960s and 70s, with jazz musicians such as Stan Kenton and Maynard Ferguson. After the advent of rock and roll, which grabbed the attention of American culture, the greatest generation, the name given to the generation of G.I. Joes and Janes who defeated Hitler in World War II, continued to listen to swing-era music. That is, at least in part because rock and roll defined itself as being the music of the younger generation. The baby boomers, the children of the greatest generation, was perhaps the first generation to be described as opposed to their parents' music, requiring a new music genre, rock and roll. Younger jazz musicians also created their own genre, bebop. But bebop never had the commercial success big band music had. Some swing musicians, such as Lawrence Welk, produced entertainment designed for the greatest generation and was mocked by the baby boomers. The Lawrence Welk Show, which featured big band, polka, and comedy acts, was a dominant force on television between 1951 and 1971. Swing singer Frank Sinatra had a variety show that ran from 1952 to 58. The Nat King Cole Show by jazz singer and pianist ran from 1956 to 57. Jazz singer Perry Como's variety show ran on CBS and then NBC between 1948 and 1967, with Christmas specials continuing until 1986. Beginning in the 1940s, some young big band musicians became unsatisfied with the genre. Looking back to more improvisatory jazz records of the 1920s, publications like the Jazzmen in 1939 aimed to bring back the sound of what was being called the Dixieland Revival, a new label used to differentiate it from big band. Few musicians popular during the 1920s made the transition from the jazz age to big band music. One of these, trumpeter and singer Louis Armstrong, remained popular until his death in 1971, stuck with swing style through the 1950s and 60s. Other musicians such as Bunk Johnson, Kid Ory, Sidney Bechet, and George Lewis re-emerged in the 1940s, enjoying successful careers with this new, younger audience. Many of these musicians worked in factories and other fields during the big band era. Others, like Jelly Roll Morton, passed away in relative obscurity before the Dixieland Revival. In Harlem, especially at Minton's Playhouse, big band sidemen like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk created bebop, a then new genre that featured fleet tempos, intricate melodic ideas, artistic originality, harmonic complexity, and virtuosic improvisations, often based on popular songs. These musicians would show up at Minton's after finishing playing with big bands at nearby dance halls and jam together until the early morning. Some jazz fans became aware of these sessions and began to attend and spread word about the exciting new music. Bebop, because its musicians saw the development as particularly artistic, found a home in universities, and as a result, most university jazz instruction today is bebop instruction. We'll listen to saxophonist Charlie Parker's 1949 recording of Salt Peanuts, which features Kenny Dorham on trumpet, Al Haig on piano, Tommy Porter on the bass, and Max Roach on the drums. I think the first soloist on that is Max Roach on the drums, and then Al Haig on piano, and then Charlie Parker comes in on the saxophone solo. Okay, that's concluding. Bebop never received the degree of popularity 1920s jazz or 30s and 40s big band gained. Much bebop music can be challenging to listen to and impossible to dance with. As Chuck Berry's 1957 song Rock and Roll Music, covered by the 1964 by the Beatles, sings, "I have no kick against modern jazz unless you try to play it too darn fast," pointing to the blazing tempos of bebop groups we're exploring. As a result, other movements in jazz, innovating from bebop, including hard bop, modal jazz, free jazz, spiritual jazz, and fusion, had somewhat paltry success. With hard bop, modal jazz, and fusion today living in universities as pedagogical repertoire, especially for students who haven't yet mastered bebop. For instance, a saxophonist who has not yet mastered Charlie Parker's Omnibook, the codified transcriptions of Parker's solos. Each would benefit from deeper study, but our analysis of jazz-era jazz and big band and bebop provide a strong foundation for understanding jazz music in the U.S. From the excitement of the 1920s to the intricacy of bebop, jazz is the music of American life, formed by and forming the ambitions of America's diverse peoples. Its improvisational soul reflects the democratic ideal, individual voices in dialogue, creating something inexact, but somehow better together.